the woman well foresaw the White House. Before the inauguration crowds, before the cannon salutes, before the mud-soaked celebration that would shock Washington society, before all of that, she was already gone. In December of 1828, just weeks after her husband won the most bitter presidential election in American history, Rachel Jackson collapsed and died at her home in Tennessee. She would never step into the White House. She would never sit beside him at the inaugural ball. She would never see the presidency she had endured decades of hardship to help him reach. But what she did see in the final months of her life was something else entirely. Public humiliation, national slander, and a political campaign that tore open her most painful private mistake and paraded it across every newspaper in America. Her name was Rachel Jackson, and in 1828, she became one of the earliest victims of full-scale American political character assassination. To understand her death, you must understand the election. To understand the election, you must understand the marriage. And to understand the marriage, you must step back into the violent, unstable, reputation-obsessed world of the early American frontier, because Rachel's story did not begin in scandal. It began in survival. Rachel was born in 1767 in what was then the American frontier, the Waxhaws region on the border of North and South Carolina. This was not the polished society of Philadelphia or Boston. It was raw land. Sparse settlements, honor culture, violence never far from the surface. She grew up during the American Revolution. Her father died before she was born. Her mother struggled. Stability was fragile. Frontier life shaped Rachel in ways Eastern elites would later mock but never fully understand. She was strong-willed, deeply religious, emotionally loyal, and shaped by a culture where personal honor mattered more than polite reputation. In 1784, at just 17 years old, she married a man named Louis Robards, a wealthy Kentucky planter. The marriage quickly deteriorated. Robards was jealous, suspicious, volatile. Letters and court testimony from later years describe arguments, emotional cruelty, and accusations of infidelity, though no proof ever substantiated them. What matters historically is not gossip, it is legal confusion. Robards left Rachel and eventually pursued a divorce. But divorce law in the late 18th century was slow, complex, and inconsistent across territories. While Robards sought legal separation, Rachel met a rising frontier lawyer and land speculator named Andrew Jackson. He was ambitious, intense, quick-tempered, charismatic. He fell in love with her, and she with him. Here is where the tragedy begins. Believing her divorce from Robards had been finalized, based on incomplete information, Rachel married Andrew Jackson in 1791, but the divorce had not yet been legally concluded. In the technical language of the law, Rachel was still married to Louis Robards when she married Andrew Jackson. The moment the mistake became clear, Jackson moved quickly to correct it. Robards' divorce was finalized in 1793. Rachel and Andrew remarried legally in 1794. From that point forward, they lived as husband and wife for more than 3 decades. On the frontier, the matter largely faded. In Washington, political society, it never would. Rachel Jackson did not crave political attention. She preferred domestic life at the Hermitage, the Jackson plantation in Tennessee. She oversaw household management. She was deeply religious, Presbyterian in conviction, devoted to prayer and scripture. Visitors described her as warm, informal, lacking the refined polish of Eastern elites, but sincere. She also lived inside contradiction. The Hermitage relied on enslaved labor. Rachel participated in plantation management within that system. Like many women of her time, her personal piety coexisted with structural participation in slavery. Historical accuracy requires acknowledging this complexity. She was neither caricature nor saint. She was a woman shaped by her world. When Andrew Jackson rose to national prominence, first as a military hero after the Battle of New Orleans, then as a presidential candidate, Rachel's past became ammunition. The election of 1824 had already been controversial. Jackson won the popular vote but lost the presidency after the House of Representatives selected John Quincy Adams in what Jackson's supporters called the corrupt bargain. By 1828, the campaign would become ruthless. Newspapers, many openly partisan, revived the story of Rachel's early marriage error. Opponents labeled her an adulteress, a bigamist, morally unfit to be First Lady. Pamphlets circulated describing the Jackson marriage as scandalous. In an era before social media, the printed press served that role. The accusations were repeated relentlessly. Rachel, deeply sensitive to religious morality, was devastated. Friends reported she wept frequently. She prayed. She read attacks that dissected events from 30 years earlier. She felt judged, not just legally, but spiritually. Andrew Jackson blamed his political enemies directly. He would later say, "They have slain her." This was not metaphor to him. He believed the stress and humiliation caused her death. In December 1828, Rachel experienced severe chest pain. She had long suffered from what doctors of the time called heart complaints. Modern historians suspect heart disease. On December 22, 1828, she died at age 61. Andrew Jackson was shattered. Those who saw him in the days after described a man undone, pacing, grieving, furious. At her funeral, he reportedly said, "May God Almighty forgive her murderers, as I know she forgave them. I never can." This moment hardened him. Historians widely argue that the bitterness of 1828 shaped Jackson's presidency. His combative style, his distrust of elites, his hostility toward political opposition. Rachel's death was not just personal tragedy. It became political fuel. When Andrew Jackson was inaugurated in March 1829, Washington society expected a polished First Lady to host elegant receptions. Instead, there was no First Lady at all. Rachel Jackson never saw the White House. Her absence hovered over the ceremony. The crowd that surged into the executive mansion after the inauguration, muddy boots, spilled punch bowls, broken china, symbolized a populist upheaval. It was a dramatic shift from the restrained republicanism of earlier administrations. But in the background of that chaotic celebration was a quiet grief. The woman who endured the attacks that helped propel Andrew Jackson to victory was not there to witness it. Rachel Jackson's story raises larger questions about American political culture. Was 1828 the first truly modern negative campaign? How did early newspapers weaponize private life? Why was a woman's moral reputation seen as legitimate campaign terrain? And how did gender expectations amplify the damage? In 1828, political attacks targeted Andrew Jackson's dueling history and temper. But the attack that cut deepest targeted his wife, because women in public life were expected to embody virtue. When Rachel's marriage history was framed as immoral, it threatened not just her, but his legitimacy. And that strategy worked. It wounded her deeply. Rachel Jackson's life forces us to confront something uncomfortable. American democracy has always included personal destruction alongside principle. The Republic was young in 1828, but political cruelty was already mature. And Rachel Jackson paid for it, with reputation, with stress, possibly with her life, honor, violence, and the defense of a name. To understand the fury that defined Andrew Jackson after Rachel's death, you must understand the world that formed him, and the world that formed her. The early American frontier was not governed primarily by polished etiquette or carefully worded political rebuttals. It was governed by reputation. Honor was currency. Insult was not rhetorical. It was combustible. And defense of one's name could escalate to bloodshed. Rachel Jackson did not live in a society that separated public life from private dignity. On the frontier, reputation was survival. A person's moral standing affected business relationships, land claims, legal credibility, and social alliances. When newspapers in 1828 resurrected her decades-old marriage confusion and framed it as adultery, it was not just embarrassing. It was existential in cultural terms. Andrew Jackson's response to slander throughout his life followed a consistent pattern: confrontation. He had dueled before. In fact, one of the most infamous duels in American political history occurred in 1806, when Jackson fought Charles Dickinson, who had insulted Rachel's character during an earlier dispute. Dickinson called Rachel a bigamist. Jackson challenged him. In that duel, Dickinson shot first, striking Jackson in the chest. Jackson remained standing, steadied himself, and returned fire, killing Dickinson. The bullet Dickinson fired would remain lodged in Jackson's body for the rest of his life. This was not symbolic posturing. It was literal violence in defense of Rachel's honor. The frontier code of honor treated reputation as sacred. Legal remedies for defamation were weak and slow. Social standing depended on visible courage. Jackson believed defending Rachel physically demonstrated loyalty and restored dignity. By the time of the 1828 election, dueling culture was fading in formal politics, but the emotional logic of honor remained deeply embedded in Jackson's identity. When campaign newspapers revived Rachel's marriage story, they did so strategically. The opposition press, particularly those aligned with President John Quincy Adams, circulated pamphlets labeling Jackson's marriage adulteress. The language was moral, not merely legal. It suggested that Rachel had knowingly lived in sin. The nuance of territorial divorce law in the 1790s did not matter. What mattered was perception. Political campaigning in 1828 marked a shift in American democracy. It was the first election conducted under expanded white male suffrage across many states. Property requirements were falling, popular participation was rising, and with broader participation came broader messaging. Campaign strategy moved beyond elite debates and into mass persuasion. Newspapers became partisan weapons. Political cartoons emerged as tools of ridicule. Personal history became legitimate ammunition. The Jackson campaign itself did not avoid harsh tactics. Adams was accused of corruption, aristocratic indulgence, and misusing public funds. But attacks on Rachel cut differently. They targeted a woman who held no office. They targeted private pain. Reports from friends suggest Rachel was emotionally shaken. She was deeply religious and interpreted public accusation through spiritual language. She believed God would judge her accusers, but she still felt wounded by the national spectacle. It is important to examine this moment carefully. Rachel was not politically naive. She knew Andrew's ambitions brought scrutiny, but she did not anticipate the intensity of moral assault. In an era when women's virtue was linked to family legitimacy, accusations of adultery struck at the core of identity. Historians debate the degree to which campaign attacks directly contributed to her death. Medical documentation from 1828 is limited. Contemporary accounts describe heart trouble and possible angina. Stress may have exacerbated underlying disease. Andrew Jackson certainly believed the connection was direct. After her death, he reportedly said, "Her spirit has been crushed by slander." Whether medically accurate or not, psychologically the belief shaped him profoundly. When Jackson assumed the presidency in March 1829, the nation saw a new style of leadership. He was combative, suspicious of elites, resistant to compromise. Many scholars argue that the emotional impact of Rachel's humiliation deepened his distrust of Washington society. He carried grief into governance. The White House he entered without her became in some ways a monument to loss. Rachel Jackson's absence defined his presidency's beginning. Her death also symbolized something broader about American political culture. The election of 1828 is often described as the birth of modern campaigning. Direct appeals to voters, emotional rhetoric, mass mobilization. But it also marked the normalization of personal destruction as political strategy. Earlier elections had been bitter, but 1828 introduced a scale of public moral assault unprecedented for its time, and a woman, not on the ballot, became collateral damage. Rachel Jackson's story forces a confrontation with the costs of democracy when competition intensifies without restraint. Was the expansion of suffrage worth the escalation of slander? Did popular politics require personal spectacle? Was this an inevitable development in a mass republic? These are not simple questions. They are foundational. Because from 1828 forward, American political culture would rarely return to restraint. The attack model worked. Jackson won, and Rachel was buried. Religion, grief, and the shadow in the White House. When Rachel Jackson died in December 1828, the immediate narrative was political, campaign slander, emotional stress, the cruelty of mass democracy. But to understand the full weight of her death, we must examine the spiritual dimension of her identity. Because Rachel did not understand her life primarily through politics, she understood it through faith. Rachel Jackson was deeply Presbyterian. Her letters and reported conversations reveal a woman grounded in Scripture, committed to prayer, and attentive to moral accountability. Religion was not ornamental for her. It structured her understanding of suffering, forgiveness, and personal conduct. She read the Bible regularly. She sought spiritual reassurance amid public humiliation. When newspapers revived the charge of adultery during the 1828 campaign, Rachel experienced it not merely as public embarrassment, but as spiritual accusation. In the moral culture of early 19th century America, female virtue was closely tied to religious standing. To be labeled immoral was to be framed as ungodly. That framing mattered. Friends recalled that she prayed for those who attacked her, that she believed divine justice would prevail. But even forgiveness does not eliminate stress. The emotional toll was real. When she collapsed and died at the Hermitage, her funeral reflected her religious identity. Andrew Jackson insisted that the ceremony emphasize faith rather than politics, yet privately, he interpreted her death through moral anger. He believed the attacks had hastened it. The man who entered the presidency in 1829 was not merely ambitious. He was grieving, and grief alters leadership. When Andrew Jackson arrived in Washington to assume office, the presidential residence, not yet widely called the White House, lacked a first lady. Rachel had been expected to reshape its social culture. Washington society anticipated her presence, though some elites quietly doubted her frontier manners. Instead, they encountered absence. The role of First Lady was still evolving. Dolly Madison had established a model of political hosting, social diplomacy, and symbolic unity. Rachel Jackson might have offered a different style, more informal, more religiously serious, less polished, but she never had the chance. Her absence created a vacuum, and that vacuum became politically significant. Because the early months of Jackson's presidency were immediately engulfed in a new social scandal, one that historians call the Petticoat Affair, the ghost of Rachel. The controversy centered around Margaret Peggy Eaton, wife of Secretary of War John Eaton. Peggy had married Eaton shortly after the death of her first husband. Washington's social elites, led by Floride Calhoun, wife of Vice President John C. Calhoun, ostracized her, insinuating impropriety. To modern observers, the Petticoat Affair may appear trivial, but in the gendered moral culture of the 1820s, accusations of sexual impropriety carried immense weight. Andrew Jackson reacted fiercely. He defended Peggy Eaton with unusual intensity. Why? Because he saw in her treatment an echo of Rachel's humiliation. Jackson believed Washington society was once again weaponizing female virtue for political power. The conflict fractured his cabinet. Several members resigned. His relationship with Vice President Calhoun deteriorated irreparably. Historians widely agree that the Petticoat Affair contributed to the collapse of Jackson's alliance with Calhoun and reshaped the political landscape. Rachel's absence haunted these events. Jackson was not merely defending Peggy Eaton. He was defending Rachel's memory, gender expectations, and political legitimacy. Rachel Jackson's death also highlights a structural issue in early American politics: the moral symbolism of political wives. In the 19th century, a president's wife embodied domestic virtue for the nation. She represented stability, morality, refinement. Attacking her character threatened the perceived legitimacy of her husband. Opponents in 1828 understood this. By reviving Rachel's marriage confusion, they aimed to undermine Andrew Jackson's moral credibility. This strategy set precedent. American political campaigns would increasingly treat family life as public terrain. Rachel Jackson became one of the earliest examples of collateral damage in reputation warfare. Transformation of the presidency. Andrew Jackson's presidency marked a turning point in American executive power. He expanded the use of the veto. He framed himself as representative of the common man. He dismantled the Second Bank of the United States. He implemented Indian removal policies, including the forced relocation that would become known as the Trail of Tears. Rachel Jackson did not shape these policies directly, but her death shaped the temperament of the man who enacted them. Historians debate how much personal grief influenced Jackson's combative leadership style. Some argue that his temperament was always volatile. Others suggest that the emotional trauma of 1828 intensified his distrust of elites and hardened his resolve. What is clear is that Rachel's death became part of his political narrative. He framed himself as protector of family honor, as victim of aristocratic slander, as champion of dignity against corruption. The emotional undercurrent of his presidency cannot be separated from the campaign that preceded it. Merry and political martyrdom, Rachel Jackson did not live to shape her own historical memory. Her legacy was constructed largely through Andrew Jackson's grief. He preserved her room at the Hermitage. He visited her grave frequently. He spoke of her in terms approaching martyrdom. This construction of Rachel as victim of political cruelty reinforced Jackson's populist identity. It presented him as a man wronged by elites, fighting on behalf of the ordinary citizen, whether one agrees with his policies or not. The emotional force of Rachel's story strengthened his connection to supporters. Political martyrdom is powerful, and Rachel became a symbol, though she never sought that role. The broader Corliss shift. The election of 1828 and Rachel's death mark a watershed in American political culture. From this point forward, campaigns would intensify personal attacks. Newspapers would expand partisan warfare. Female morality would become a recurring political weapon. Presidential families would live under scrutiny. Rachel Jackson stands at the origin of that shift. Her story is not simply about tragedy. It is about transition. The United States was moving from elite-managed republic to mass participation democracy. And mass politics is rarely gentle. Rachel Jackson's life asks us to consider a difficult truth. Democracy amplifies voices. It also amplifies cruelty. She never held office. She never gave a campaign speech. She never entered the White House. Yet her private life became public ammunition, and the consequences were permanent. Jury F. The governor presidency. When Andrew Jackson took the oath of office in March of 1829, the United States witnessed a transformation not only in leadership style, but in political emotion. The inauguration was chaotic. Thousands of supporters crowded into Washington, surging into the executive mansion in celebration. Punch bowls overturned, carpets muddied, furniture strained under the weight of unfamiliar populist enthusiasm. The elite Republican restraint of earlier administrations had yielded to something louder, broader, more democratic. But inside that crowd-filled mansion, there was a silence. Rachel was not there. Rachel Jackson had been expected to host, to receive, to symbolize domestic virtue within a changing political order. Instead, her absence became part of the presidency's emotional architecture. Andrew Jackson carried grief into office like a private wound beneath public authority. Visitors in those early months described a president who oscillated between charm and intensity. Jackson could be warm, direct, and engaging with ordinary citizens, but he was also deeply sensitive to perceived betrayal. His trust was hard-won and easily fractured. Historians have long debated how much of that temperament was innate frontier disposition, and how much was sharpened by the events of 1828. Rachel's death became for Jackson evidence of elite cruelty. He did not see her passing as natural decline. He saw it as moral consequence. The newspapers that attacked her, the political opponents who circulated pamphlets, the Washington figures who sneered at frontier manners. He believed they had broken her spirit. That belief mattered, because it shaped how he governed, medical orility, and political memory. Modern medical historians reviewing Rachel's symptoms suggest that she likely suffered from chronic heart disease, possibly worsened by stress. Angina and cardiac weakness were not well understood in early 19th century medicine. Emotional strain can exacerbate such conditions, but it rarely functions as sole cause. Andrew Jackson, however, did not think in cardiology. He thought in honor. In his worldview, slander had weight. It could wound physically. It could kill, whether scientifically accurate or not. That interpretation became political mythology. Supporters embraced it. It reinforced the narrative of Jackson as champion of the people. fighting corrupt aristocrats who had stooped so low as to attack a woman's reputation. Political mythology does not require medical precision. It requires emotional resonance. Rachel's death resonated. The long shadow of 1828. The election of 1828 permanently altered American campaign strategy. Prior elections had included sharp disagreement, but this one normalized sustained personal assault as an effective tactic. The tools were simple: partisan newspapers, pamphlets, public meetings. But the effect was transformative. After 1828, candidate spouses became visible political symbols. Moral allegations became campaign currency. Personal history became fair terrain for partisan attack. Rachel Jackson stands at the threshold of that transformation. Her humiliation was not the first instance of political slander in American history, but it was one of the first nationally amplified moral scandals targeting a presidential spouse. The precedent endured. Populism and decorum. Andrew Jackson's presidency is often described as the rise of populism. Property qualifications for voting had dropped in many states. Political participation widened among white male citizens. Jackson framed himself as representative of the common man against entrenched elites. Rachel's story fed that narrative. She was portrayed as a sincere frontier woman mocked by aristocratic insiders. The tension between frontier authenticity and Eastern decorum became symbolic of broader class divisions. But there is complexity here. Rachel was also mistress of a plantation worked by enslaved people. The populism of Jacksonian democracy expanded participation for white men, not for women, not for Black Americans, not for Native nations. The same presidency that defended Rachel's honor oversaw policies like Indian removal that inflicted devastating consequences. History resists simple heroes and villains. Rachel Jackson was both victim of political cruelty and participant in a slaveholding household. Andrew Jackson was both defender of his wife's reputation and architect of aggressive executive policy. Democracy expanded selectively. Final years of Andrew Jackson. After leaving office in 1837, Andrew Jackson returned to the Hermitage. His health declined steadily. He suffered from chronic pain, the lingering bullet from his duel decades earlier, and ongoing illness. He visited Rachel's grave frequently. He instructed that he be buried beside her. He never publicly forgave those he believed responsible for her suffering. In death, their graves stood together, symbolic closure to a partnership forged in controversy, endurance, and mutual loyalty. Historiography. How scholars interpret Rachel Jackson. Historians approach Rachel Jackson from several angles. Political culture analysis. As early example of personal attack in democratic elections, gender studies perspective. As case study in how female virtue was weaponized politically. Honor culture framework. As key to understanding Jackson's dueling history and reactive temperament. Populism. Evolution. As symbolic catalyst for Jacksonian political identity. Most scholars agree on one point. Rachel's death intensified Jackson's emotional approach to leadership. It did not create his temperament, but it reinforced it. The enduring question: Rachel Jackson never held office. She never delivered policy speeches. She never shaped legislation directly. Yet her life reveals something essential about American democracy. Private lives do not remain private when power is involved. And when politics becomes mass spectacle, dignity becomes vulnerable. Rachel Jackson's story is not just about scandal. It is about transition, from restrained Republican culture to emotional mass democracy, from gentlemanly disagreement to partisan warfare, from personal reputation to national spectacle. She paid the cost of that transition, and her absence in the White House remains one of the quietest, most haunting moments in early American political history. Memory, modernity, and the price of published life. When we look back at the election of 1828 from a distance of nearly 2 centuries, it is tempting to see it as inevitable, the natural growing pains of an expanding democracy. But for Rachel Jackson, it was not structural evolution. It was personal devastation. And in that distinction lies the enduring power of her story. Rachel Jackson never gave a speech defending herself. She never published a rebuttal. She never stepped into a public hall to confront her accusers. Her world was not one in which women claimed the stage. Her defense came through Andrew Jackson's fury and through the loyalty of friends who insisted that the divorce confusion had been genuine misunderstanding, not moral corruption. But the newspapers did not require nuance. They required narrative, and the narrative they chose was scandal. The marriage technicality from the 1790s became, in 1828, a morality play, the timing of her remarriage. Before Robarts' divorce had been finalized, was framed not as frontier legal confusion, but as adultery. The fact that the legal divorce was later completed and the marriage solemnized again properly did not satisfy opponents. The damage had been done. What makes Rachel Jackson's case historically significant is not merely that she was attacked. It is that the attack proved politically effective. Andrew Jackson won the presidency in a landslide of electoral votes. His supporters rallied more fiercely in response to what they viewed as cruel aristocratic mockery. The slander did not weaken him, it hardened him, and that hardening shaped American executive power for generations. The evolution of political scandal. After 1828, American campaigns rarely returned to pre-modern restraint. The expansion of the electorate meant candidates had to mobilize emotion, not simply argument. Character became currency. Family became proxy battlefield. The moral life of candidate spouses became political shorthand. Rachel Jackson was among the first presidential wives subjected to sustained national moral scrutiny. She would not be the last. Later first ladies would endure rumors, caricatures, partisan distortions, and relentless public analysis. But Rachel's case occurred at the very moment when American politics shifted from elite-managed republic to mass democratic theater. Her humiliation marks an origin point, memory and symbolism. Rachel Jackson's memory was curated carefully by Andrew Jackson and his allies. She was described as gentle, pious, wronged. Portraits emphasize softness rather than controversy. The narrative of martyrdom, a woman slain by slander, reinforced Jackson's populist image. Memory is political. By casting Rachel as innocent victim of elite cruelty, Jackson's supporters strengthened their argument that the political establishment was morally corrupt. Her story became part of a broader anti-aristocratic identity that defined Jacksonian democracy. Yet historians must resist simplifying her into symbol alone. Rachel Jackson was not merely martyr. She was also plantation mistress at the Hermitage. She participated in a household that relied on enslaved labor. She lived within the contradictions of her era, devout in faith, loyal in marriage, embedded in systems of inequality. To tell her story honestly is to hold all of that together: gender, power, and published life. Rachel's experience reveals the intersection of gender expectations and political legitimacy. In early America, a man's public credibility was tethered to his wife's moral standing. Attacking Rachel was a way of attacking Andrew, but it also exposed a deeper anxiety in democratic culture, the fear that private life might reveal hypocrisy in public leadership. The Republic prided itself on virtue. When accusations threatened that virtue, they resonated powerfully. Rachel Jackson's ordeal underscores how women in political proximity have historically borne disproportionate reputational risk. She had no vote. She had no office. She had no platform. Yet her life became contested territory. Jacksonian democracy and its limits. Andrew Jackson's presidency is often remembered for expanding white male suffrage and challenging entrenched financial elites. But it also carried exclusionary policies, most notably Indian removal. The same administration, shaped by grief and anger over Rachel's humiliation, would oversee forced displacement of native nations. This is not contradiction by accident. It reflects the complexity of democratic expansion. Jacksonian democracy widened participation for some while deepening injustice for others. Rachel Jackson's story exists within that broader tapestry. Her personal suffering did not translate into universal compassion and policy. History rarely distributes empathy evenly. The final resting place. At the Hermitage in Tennessee, Rachel's grave remains beside Andrew Jackson's. The inscription speaks of faith and loyalty. Visitors often learn her story in summary: attacked during campaign, died before inauguration. But summary obscures depth. She was born into frontier instability. She endured an unhappy first marriage. She navigated legal confusion. She built a home. She survived decades of political ascent. She faced national moral assault. She died weeks before entering the White House. Her life traces the transformation of American politics from revolutionary republic to populist democracy, and it asks an enduring question. What does democracy cost the families of those who seek power? Lessons for modern. Lessons for modern politics. Rachel Jackson's story does not belong solely to the 19th century. The weaponization of private life remains central in modern campaigns. Media amplification has grown faster and more intense. Personal histories are excavated and reframed instantly, but the emotional architecture is familiar. The assumption that moral narrative influences political legitimacy began long before television or the internet. It was already alive in 1828. Rachel Jackson was among its earliest casualties. The Q at irony. Andrew Jackson would go on to become one of the most consequential presidents in American history. His face would appear on currency. His legacy would shape debates about executive power, populism, and constitutional authority. Rachel Jackson never saw any of it. The woman whose reputation helped galvanize his support did not live to witness the victory. In that irony lies the human core of her story. Politics moves forward. Individuals bear the weight. Rachel Jackson did not seek public life. Public life found her. And when it did, it changed American democracy forever. Frontier law, divorce confusion, and the legal foundations of the scandal. To understand the 1828 moral explosion, we must first reconstruct the legal environment of the 1790s. The accusation against Rachel Jackson rested on one central claim, that she had knowingly married Andrew Jackson while still legally married to Louis Robards. That claim, repeated relentlessly in partisan newspapers, simplified a far more complicated frontier legal reality. In the 1790s, divorce was governed by state and territorial statute, not uniform federal law. Kentucky, then part of Virginia, later a state in 1792, required legislative action or judicial decree for final divorce. Proceedings were slow. Communication between territories was unreliable. Legal notices could take months to circulate. Archival court records from Kentucky show that Louis Robards petitioned for divorce on grounds of adultery in 1791, but final legislative approval did not occur until 1793. During this period, Rachel and Andrew Jackson believed the divorce had been completed. This confusion was not unusual on the frontier. Legal historian Norma Bash has documented the fluidity of marital dissolution in post-revolutionary America, particularly in Western territories where court access and bureaucratic coordination were inconsistent. Squared yet by 1828, nuance vanished. The legal ambiguity of 1791 was reframed as moral certainty. Primary newspaper language. The weaponization of virtue. The election of 1828 produced one of the earliest documented instances of nationally coordinated character attack through partisan press networks. In 1828, the Cincinnati Gazette reprinted pamphlets referring to Jackson's marriage as an adulteress connection. The Coffin Handbills, a notorious anti-Jackson broadside, listed alleged crimes and moral failures, including reference to the notorious marriage of General Jackson with the wife of another man. The National Journal and other pro-Adams outlets circulated similar insinuations. The language was deliberate. Bigamy, adulteress, abandoned female, moral unfitness for the head of a Christian nation. These were not legal arguments. They were theological indictments, and they resonated in a republic that publicly celebrated Christian morality as civic virtue. Political communication scholar Jeffrey Pasley notes that the partisan press of the 1820s operated less as neutral information source and more as ideological instrument. Editors openly aligned with candidates and treated opposition as moral threat. Rachel Jackson became a symbolic vulnerability. Gendered political vulnerability. Modern feminist historiography emphasizes that Rachel's attack functioned differently from attacks on Andrew Jackson. Andrew was accused of violence, dueling, and temper. These charges reinforced his image as fierce and decisive. Rachel was accused of sexual immorality. The asymmetry is crucial. As historian Catherine Algor argues, early American political wives carried the burden of national virtue. A woman's moral standing validated a man's claim to Republican leadership. To discredit Rachel was to discredit Jackson's household governance, a metaphor for national governance. Women had no vote, but they were central to political symbolism. Rachel's vulnerability was structural. Honor culture theory. Violence as reputation defense. Andrew Jackson's dueling history cannot be dismissed as impulsive aggression alone. Southern honor culture, as analyzed by historian Bertram Wyatt Brown, operated under strict codes. Insult required response. Failure to respond implied weakness. The 1806 duel between Andrew Jackson and Charles Dickinson is well documented. Dickinson reportedly referred to Rachel as a bigamist during prior dispute. Jackson challenged him. Primary accounts confirmed Dickinson shot first, striking Jackson in the chest. Jackson returned fire and killed Dickinson. Thus, this duel reveals that Rachel's reputation had already been defended through violence decades before 1828. The campaign resurrected not just rumor, but old wounds. Election data context. The scale of 1828. The election of 1828 was transformative. Popular vote totals. Andrew Jackson, 638,338 votes. John Quincy Adams, 557,440 votes. Electoral College, Jackson, 178. Adams, 83. This landslide reflected expanded suffrage among white men. Property requirements have been relaxed in many states. Mass participation required mass persuasion, and mass persuasion incentivized emotional narrative. Rachel's story became part of a broader populist framing. Frontier authenticity versus elite hypocrisy. Theological framing and moral anxiety. Rachel Jackson was a devout Presbyterian. Contemporary letters describe her religious seriousness and reliance on Scripture. After the 1828 attacks intensified, acquaintances reported she prayed frequently and expressed distress at public accusation. One letter from Andrew Jackson to John Overton, January 1829, states, "She was the object of slander too base to repeat. Her spirit bore what her heart could not." Though historians debate the literal causality between stress and death, Jackson believed firmly that campaign slander contributed to her fatal heart condition. This belief shaped executive temperament. Historiography. Interpretive divide. Scholars divide into several interpretive camps. 1. Structural modernization. Thesis. Some historians argue the 1828 election represents inevitable modernization of democratic campaigning. Negative tactics were symptoms of expanded suffrage, not personal vendetta. 2. Gendered martyrdom. Thesis. Others emphasize Rachel as early victim of misogynistic political culture, arguing that her treatment reveals structural exploitation of female virtue for partisan gain. 3. Populist identity construction. Political historians argue Jackson's framing of Rachel's death strengthened his anti-elite identity and consolidated populist legitimacy. 4. Medical skepticism. Medical historians caution against overstating stress causality in heart disease cases, emphasizing pre-existing conditions. Consensus remains elusive, but agreement exists on one point. 1828 changed American political culture permanently. The Petticoat Affair as psychological continuation. The 1829 to 1831 Petticoat Affair, involving Margaret Eaton, illustrates how Rachel's memory influenced governance. Jackson's aggressive defense of Peggy Eaton mirrored his defense of Rachel. Cabinet fractures during the affair demonstrate how gendered moral controversy could destabilize executive administration. Historians widely interpret this episode as emotionally linked to Rachel's prior humiliation. Slavery and moral complexity. Any academic edition must address contradiction. Rachel Jackson presided over the Hermitage, a plantation worked by enslaved people. Estate inventories document enslaved laborers by name and valuation. Her personal piety coexisted with participation in slaveholding society. This duality reflects broader Southern evangelical culture, where religious devotion did not automatically produce abolitionist sentiment. Modern scholarship rejects simplistic moral binaries. Rachel was both devout and complicit in structural injustice. Communication revolution. Newspapers as pre-modern social media. By 1828, the United States had over 800 newspapers. Postal subsidies enabled widespread circulation. Editors frequently reprinted partisan content across state lines. The attack on Rachel was not isolated to one city. It was networked. This early communication web resembles modern viral amplification in structural terms. Rachel Jackson's scandal demonstrates how rapidly narrative can escalate once media ecosystems align. Political legacy. Andrew Jackson's presidency expanded executive authority. Aggressive veto usage. Bank war confrontation. Indian Removal Act, 1830. Expansion of white male suffrage. Rachel's death did not cause these policies, but it shaped the emotional atmosphere in which Jackson operated. Personal grievance fused with populist ideology. Transitional conclusion. Rachel Jackson stands at the threshold of modern political character warfare. Her story is not solely about personal tragedy. It is about the legal fragility of frontier marriage law, the gendered symbolism of Republican virtue, the weaponization of morality in Democratic campaigns, the fusion of grief and executive power, the birth of national partisan spectacle. And this is only the beginning of the ultra-deep academic expansion. By 1828, the United States had developed one of the most dense print cultures in the Atlantic world. Postal subsidies enacted under the early republic dramatically reduced newspaper distribution costs. By the late 1820s, over 800 newspapers circulated nationwide. Literacy rates among white men were high compared to Europe. Political content spread rapidly through reprinting networks. The presidential campaign of 1828 did not invent negativity, but it institutionalized it, and Rachel Jackson became one of its most visible human casualties. Primary pamphlet evidence. The coffin handbills. One of the most infamous anti-Jackson broadsides was known as the coffin handbill. Though primarily focused on alleged executions of militiamen under Jackson's military command, it also referenced his immoral marriage. A surviving copy preserved in the Library of Congress includes language such as, "Ought a convicted adulteress and her paramour husband to preside over the moral destiny of this Christian republic." The phrasing is revealing. It does not argue legal technicality. It invokes religious judgment. The charge was designed to resonate in a Protestant moral culture that equated domestic virtue with national legitimacy. Newspaper excerpts from the National Journal, June 1828, refer to Rachel's earlier marriage as a connection disgraceful to Christian decorum. The repeated emphasis on decorum signals the elite anxiety underlying Adams-aligned publications. This was not merely about adultery. It was about social class. Rachel was frontier. Washington elites were Eastern. Moral framing became class warfare. The mechanism of amplification. Newspapers rarely operated independently. Editors routinely reprinted content from allied publications. An attack printed in Philadelphia could appear in Richmond days later, then reprinted in Cincinnati, then in New York. The press network functioned as an early analog to viral media. Jeffrey Pasley's research demonstrates that editors in the 1820s saw themselves as political actors, not neutral observers. They coordinated messaging across state lines. They crafted narrative arcs. Rachel's marriage story was not spontaneous gossip. It was strategic deployment, divorce law in technical detail. To assess the moral weight of the accusation, one must return to the divorce procedure itself. Lewis Robards filed charges of adultery in Kentucky in 1791. Divorce required legislative approval after court proceedings. During the interim, separation was socially acknowledged but not always legally finalized. Communication lag between Kentucky and Tennessee territories likely contributed to misunderstanding. Evidence suggests Rachel believed the divorce had been granted before marrying Andrew Jackson. In 1794, after finalization, Andrew and Rachel remarried legally to remove doubt. No criminal prosecution followed. The matter faded for decades. Until 1828, the revival demonstrates how dormant legal irregularities can be politically weaponized long after resolution. Honor culture and the politics of masculinity. To fully interpret Andrew Jackson's reaction, we must examine the theory of honor culture articulated by historian Bertram Wyatt Brown. Squared. In Southern honor systems, reputation equaled legitimacy. Public insult required visible response. The 1806 duel between Jackson and Charles Dickinson was directly linked to slander of Rachel's character. Dickinson's alleged insult, calling Rachel a bigamist, triggered challenge. Primary duel accounts describe Dickinson shooting first, striking Jackson in the chest. Jackson's delayed but fatal return shot solidified his reputation for courage and retaliation. The bullet remained lodged near his heart for life. This physical artifact symbolizes the persistence of insult memory. When the 1828 campaign revived the accusation, it reopened an honor wound decades old, electoral expansion and democratic emotion. The election of 1828 was conducted in a transformed political environment. Between 1800 and 1828, most states eliminated property requirements for white male voters. Voter participation surged. Approximate turnout increased dramatically compared to 1824. Mass participation required emotional mobilization. Jacksonian Democrats framed their candidate as champion of the common man against aristocratic corruption. Rachel's treatment became evidence of elite cruelty. Populism thrives on moral narrative. Her suffering became political fuel. Religious identity and psychological strain. Rachel Jackson's Presbyterian devotion shaped her internal response. Contemporary recollection suggests she wept over pamphlets and expressed anguish at public misrepresentation. Andrew Jackson wrote in January 1829, "Her heart has been broken by slander." Modern medical scholarship cautions against equating stress directly with cardiac death. However, stress can exacerbate pre-existing heart conditions. Rachel had long complained of chest pain. Whether causal or coincidental, the perception of political causation shaped historical memory. Andrew Jackson never forgave. The Petticoat Affair revisited. Structural echo. The 1829-1831 social controversy involving Margaret Eaton illustrates how gendered moral politics destabilized governance. When cabinet wives ostracized Peggy Eaton, Jackson interpreted the episode through Rachel's lens. He defended Eaton vigorously, leading to cabinet resignations and deep fracture with Vice President John C. Calhoun. Scholars argue the Petticoat Affair was less about Eaton herself and more about unresolved grievance over Rachel's humiliation. Grief translated into executive stubbornness, slavery, plantation life, and ethical complexity of state inventories from the Hermitage list. Dozens of enslaved individuals by name, age, and monetary value. Rachel Jackson participated in plantation management. Her piety coexisted with slaveholding. This duality reflects broader Southern evangelical culture, where religious conviction did not automatically produce anti-slavery activism. Modern scholarship resists romanticizing her victimhood without acknowledging structural participation in enslavement. Rachel Jackson's life sits at the intersection of vulnerability and complicity. Historiographical debate. Scholars remain divided on several questions. Was 1828 uniquely vicious? Some argue earlier elections included harsh rhetoric, but 1828 institutionalized personal scandal as central strategy. Did Rachel's death significantly alter Jackson's presidency? Robert Remine suggests emotional impact intensified Jackson's combative governance. Others argue temperament was already fixed. Is Rachel best understood as proto-martyr or structural symbol? Feminist historians emphasize her as early example of gendered vulnerability in mass politics. Consensus remains partial, but the significance of 1828 is uncontested. Media evolution, structural continuity to modern campaigning. The press system of 1828 demonstrates that technological limitations do not prevent narrative amplification. Postal routes enabled rapid distribution. Editors created partisan echo chambers. The structure resembles modern digital polarization. Ideological alignment. Rapid reprinting. Emotional framing. Moral absolutism. Rachel Jackson's scandal represents early proof that political systems incentivize personal attack when competition intensifies. Cultural memory construction. After her death, Andrew Jackson preserved Rachel's bedroom at the Hermitage. Visitors encountered a curated narrative of piety and injustice. Her grave inscription emphasized religious virtue. Memory became political reinforcement. The narrative of martyrdom supported Jacksonian populist identity. Transitional synthesis. Rachel Jackson's story is not a peripheral anecdote.